So you want to get into the Ys games? Well, you've come to the right place. Ys is a flagship series of Neon Falcon that has existed since 1987, and is undoubtedly my favourite action-based JRPG franchise. It encompasses everything I feel a great action RPG should have, and excels in many areas that I hold close to me for that particular subset of game, like music, fast-paced gameplay, enjoyable exploration, and surprisingly deep lore. Over the years, it blanketed me with several of my favourite gaming memories, and I'm more than happy to sing its praises at any opportunity I can get to hopefully bring more curious onlookers on board. And with Ys 10 Nordics on the way later this year, there's never been a better time to get involved. But the question remains, where do you even start? It's not a stretch to say that a newcomer could be overwhelmed with the sheer amount of games this series has. After all, the general premise of Ys, with the odd exception, is to recount the adventures of Adol Kristin, which are told through his personal memoirs. Each game is a retelling of one of those books, spread across an in-universe timeline, where Adol ranges from his earliest years at the age of 16 to the latest iteration where he is in his mid-20s, and there are around 100 records of Adol's journeys around the known world. So there's certainly plenty more on the shelf, considering at present only around 10 have been translated to a game. Even so, because of the standalone nature of the games in many cases, players have the benefit of pretty much starting wherever they want without much detriment, though some of the entries do draw on prior events for added enjoyment. In addition, there's understandable confusion, as the games often have multiple versions, but Falcom have been taking it upon themselves for a couple of decades now to ensure that each game has a canonical version that acts as the official representation of that adventure. This video will be focusing on those canonical titles, and will also present a brief overview of each game in the order they were released, as I feel that this path allows players to see the growth of the series over time, though I will also mention where they fall in the timeline should you wish to play them in chronological order instead. It's worth noting as well that the newest game, Ys 10, will not be included when mentioning this timeline, evidently because it has yet to release for Western fans. And with that, we begin with the first collection of games, Ys 1 and 2. Now, no doubt, this will be the first point of confusion for some, as the original Ys 1 and 2 have had numerous enhancements and re-releases over the years. Even so, the one that most players will have access to will be the PC version, called Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles Plus, which is a bundle of the first two games as they effectively take place one after the other, and as such, they're often considered as two parts of the same game. On the timeline, they are the second chronologically. It takes place in the land of Asteria, and Adol is tasked with finding the 6 books of Ys to eventually stop a great evil. The story itself, though direct and satisfying in its own way, is definitely a product of that period, as is much of the rest of the game. There's no doubt that Ys 1 and 2 will feel dated by today's standards, especially in regards to gameplay, as the bump system that is utilised here has its charm, but is certainly an acquired taste. You'll often have to run into enemies from behind or attack them at an angle to ensure Adol doesn't meet an early demise, and that alone can be a point of contention. There's also very little in the way of direction given to the player, and I must admit that the final boss of Ys 1 can be a point of frustration. However, despite showing its age, these two games were the first glimpse of the Ys magic that endures today. A sense of adventure, the silent yet stoic protagonist and Adol, the introduction of long-running recurrent characters and the amazing music are all staples of these two games, and those themes have been mostly consistent as the series has pushed on. I can't see them being fan favourites for many new players, but they give a glimpse into what the series is all about, and they're also notably short. Both games can easily be completed in around 10 hours combined. As a starting point, I'd recommend this one. Our next entry though is another story, and that's purely because till this day, it's the only game that has yet to receive a remake from Falcom, and that is Ys 5 Lost Kefin Kingdom of Sand, which is the 5th chronological title on the timeline. Kefin is often coined as the black sheep of the Ys series. It released in 1995 for the Super Famicom and came at a time where Neon Falcom as a company was struggling in more ways than one. The result of Ys V was a clear representation of that, and outside of a PS2 remake for Japan only, it's been mostly forgotten for the time being. Yet even if you are able to access it, you'd be met with a game that is an Ys title in name only. The gameplay, music and overall feel of Kefin, while a good game as a standalone, was quite simply not representative of the Ys series, so much so that it caused the franchise to go on a long hiatus following its commercial failure. It has useless mechanics like ineffectual magic, a generally considered weaker collection of music due to releasing for the Super Famicom, which didn't have the technology required to flesh out the game's compositions like the PC-88 could, and it's also notably easy, so easy in fact that the game was re-released with an expert mode soon after. Hope remains that it too will attract its own remake in the near future, but quite simply, I don't recommend this one as a starting point at all. It would take around a decade after Kefin for Ys to be revisited in 2003, and Falcom knew that this one had to be good to bring fans back on board. The result of their work would birth the Napishtim engine trilogy, 3 titles named as such because of the gameplay they used and the title that utilised it first. Ys VI, the Ark of Napishtim, the 7th title chronologically in the timeline. There's no doubt that Ark of Napishtim has a veritable place in Ys history, as it had the unenviable task of restoring goodwill with veterans while also acting as an entry point for newer players. Thankfully for us, it did just that. The identity of Ys returned in Ys VI while also modernising the older style, and in many ways it would form the foundation from which Ys games would evolve for the future. In that regard, I consider Ys VI to be timeless. It's nothing special in the modern day, especially when considering its later contemporaries, but it's still a great game, with Adol stranded on the Canaan Islands after a shipwreck as he attempts to find a way of eventually escaping. Control is pretty much exclusively tied to Adol in this game with an isometric camera view. He gains new abilities, items and equipments over the adventure, and it's all accompanied by a wonderful synthesized soundtrack and charming presentation, especially in regards to its pre-rendered backgrounds. There's no doubt it has some frustrating mechanics at points, like the so-called dash jump ability coupled with fairly precise platforming, but other than that, everything else ranges from decent to wonderful. It's also fairly short, as many of the earlier Ys games are, clocking in at around just over 10 hours, and as such I'd happily recommend this as a good starting point. Plus, if you want a laugh, check out the PS2 version after you finish for some of the best cutscenes ever devised. While Ark of Napishtim gets my seal as a good starting point, the same rings true for the second Napishtim engine game, Ys the Oath and Felghana. This is one of the canonical remakes for the series, replacing Ys 3 Wanderers from Ys, and is the 4th game chronologically on the timeline. Oath takes place in the land of Felghana, the homeland of Adol's adventuring partner Dogi, who is a frequent companion on many of his adventures. Upon visiting the land though, it's clear that some dark machinations are afoot, and Adol sets out to bring peace back to the land. It plays very similarly to its predecessor. Control is exclusively tied to Ad-Hoc. You explore the land, there are elements of platforming, and Ad-Hoc gradually grows stronger through items he finds and through traditional levelling up. Even so, it does have some improvements to keep the gameplay more action-focused, with particular import given to the idea of keeping players out of menus and more on the action itself. The aim of Felghana was simply to build on what Napishtim did well, and it's fair to say that many believe that Falcom succeeded. Many older Ys fans in particular consider Felghana to be the best game in the series, representing its peak in terms of gameplay, music and characters. I personally don't echo the same sentiments, but I do agree that Felghana is an excellent title, and definitely the best game of the Napishtim engine trilogy, making it an easy recommendation to new players, especially when considering its short runtime once again of around 10 hours. There's also mild hope that it could come to more modern platforms too, as a remaster called Ys Memoir the Felghana recently released in Japan. Finally, for the Napishtim engine titles is Ys Origin, and as the name suggests, it is the origin of the Ys series, taking place 700 years before Ad-Hoc's first adventure. As such, it's the only game in the series that doesn't use the red-haired protagonist, and instead splits the story between different characters, each with their own unique take on gameplay. The game itself is set in a huge tower that stretches to the sky, and the entire adventure takes place within this structure, with players clearing stratums and bosses on their way to the top. Many characters, concepts or events seen in Ys Origin are later touched upon in Ys 1 and 2, and as such if you're going down a more story or lore focused route, I'd suggest starting with Ys Origin purely due to the background it gives for those games. Even so, Ys Origin is still an easy recommendation for me, not only due to its position canonically but also based on personal experience, since it was the first game I played over 10 years ago. As such, if it was enough to bring me on board, I'm certain it will have the same results for others. While I feel its story is hampered by the fact that you have to play through the game 3 times to see it all, it's the gameplay that keeps the experience fresh. Every character is controlled via an isometric view similar to Napishtim and Oath, and each will get various upgrades and abilities as they progress, with fast-paced, action-centric gameplay forming the bulk of the experience, and platforming incorporated at certain junctures too. The bosses in particular are a high point though, often taking up the whole screen, and all of the adventure is accompanied with the signature synth rock style of the series. And even though those multiple playthroughs are needed for the full experience, each one will take around 8 to 10 hours to complete, so it's not the most arduous in terms of time invested. Needless to say, Ys Origin is also a great starting point for the series. With the end of Ys Origin, it would also mark the end of the Napishtim engine titles and herald a new dawn of gameplay, which remained for the final 4 Western titles till now. Ys VII was the first to utilise this shift in approach, and would see Ad-Hoc travel in a team rather than solo across the land of Altargo. It would also be one of his later adventures, being the 8th chronologically, and also mark a shift in the overall length of the games going forward, taking around 20 hours to complete. Now Ys VII originally came out on the PSP, and much like the earlier games, it's pretty much only available on PC in terms of modern hardware. And that's a shame, because for me, E7 is hugely underappreciated, my second favourite game in the entire series. It encompasses nearly everything I look for in an Ys game, and there are several elements within it that haven't been topped to this day, those being the boss battles, which are at their best in this iteration, the dungeons, and also its story, which is a level above, at least in regards to Ys as a whole, bringing in the best antagonist that the series has seen yet. Even so, if you gauge the wider opinion of this game, you'll find that a fair few don't view it as highly as I do, which I don't understand. Even the gameplay, despite being the first of its kind, has held up well. In the group-based games, you can freely change between members, and each of them has a specialty that preys on a certain enemy weakness. For example, Ad-Hol's slashing ability will be effective against slime-based creatures, while bow users are effective against flying enemies, and so on. Plus, it remains the only canonical game till now that makes Dogi a playable character, which in itself is mad to think of. I'd say the only downside to E7 in terms of being a starting point is that accessibility once again, but if you can get your hands on it, give it a whirl. It's one of my favourite games for a reason. Thankfully, this next entry does not suffer from that same issue, as in addition to PC, it's also available on PS4 as well. Not perfect, but a step in the right direction nonetheless. It's the second of the group-based games in Ys Memories of Celceta, and is the third game chronologically in the timeline. Much like Oath and Felghana, Memories of Celceta is a canonical remake, this time of Ys 4, which in itself was split into two versions, Dawn of Ys and Mask of the Sun. Falcom sought to rectify the discrepancy by creating their own in-house version, which would act as the definitive representation of one of Ad-Hol's earliest adventures. Set in the Great Forest of Celceta, Ad-Hol once again ends up shipwrecked and has lost his memories. Over the course of this journey, he joins several others on a quest to not only regain those memories, but reaffirm to himself as to why he became an adventurer in the first place. Now, Memories of Celceta is an odd one, as for all intents it should have improved on many aspects of E7 by virtue of being a successor. And while it is still a great game and can indeed act as a good starting point, Memories of Celceta feels like it's missing something compared to the others of its ilk. Its group-based gameplay is mostly similar, and it's still got a lot of the staples like awesome music and an intriguing land to explore, but it does have some notable weaknesses, mostly in regards to the balancing of its combat, as range characters are just far too overtuned, and the antagonists are some of the most forgettable the series has seen yet. I'm also of the mind that the story on offer here is fairly uninspired, with a notably disappointing climax. That being said, the gameplay holds up, and it's still an enjoyable experience overall for the 20 or so hours you'll be playing it. I would say start with E7 should you prefer the look of the group-based gameplay compared to the Napishtim engine titles, but if this is the only one you can access, it'll still do the job. While I have reservations in recommending Memories of Celceta as a starting point, I have no such issue doing so with Ys VIII Lacrimosa of Dana, which is the 6th game canonically on the timeline. Not only is it one of the most accessible titles, being on PS4, PS5, Switch and PC, it's also what I consider to be the best game in the series, a near-on perfect action RPG, and one that I consider to be a 10 out of 10. I'm of the mind that no game is flawless, but as long as the drawbacks don't detract from the overall offering, then I'm fine in overlooking them. And VIII, while it has some small issues, does everything else so well that the package as a whole is as close to perfection as it gets. It is the quintessential Ys game for me. Everything that the series is known for, that being its fast-paced combat, its amazing music, its sense of wonder, everything is at an extremely high level, and it brings in so many unique aspects of its own that allow it to stand above the rest, like its heroine, who is easily the best within the series, no contest at all. Much like previous titles, Adol finds himself shipwrecked when the commercial liner the Lombardia is sunk by an unknown entity. Finding himself stranded on the Isle of Saren, a landmass that very little is known about, his role is to find the survivors of the Lombardia while also working to discover the ultimate mystery of the land, very similar to the other entries in that respect. Even so, no action RPG within this series or outside of it has matched the joy that Ys VIII gave me. For all intents, it's still a similar brand of team-based gameplay, though it certainly feels more refined and tight control-wise. But then there are all the additional aspects that add to the experience, like the massive amount of optional areas to explore, finding all the survivors who have their own individual stories, and rebuilding a home base using raw materials found around the island, all the while searching for any clue to aid in an escape. Needless to say, this simple premise evolves into something far greater as the hours pass. Granted, it's a longer game than the earlier entries, around 40 hours for a standard playthrough, but when the game is as good as this, I wish it was double that. Easiest recommendation for a starting point.
Have you ever had a dream where you weren't you? You were someone else? It was in this prison where my dreams and my reality, once separate, became intertwined.
Rounding out this video is the last of the group-based games in Ys IX Monstrum Nox, which is also the latest game in the timeline. Much like Ys VIII, it is available on a multitude of modern hardware like PS4, PS5, Switch and PC, and clocks in at around 35 hours for a playthrough. Now, Monstrum Nox is an interesting game and does divide opinions somewhat because, for all intents, it goes against the grain of Ys as a series. All of the titles up till now take on the theme of unbridled adventure. Even if Adol finds himself trapped on an island per se, you still get the liberating feeling of exploring a vast land. Monstrum Nox pretty much does a 180 on this. Adol is apprehended at the gates of the prison city of Bolduc, and the adventure this time around sees him become a sort of vigilante. He gains the power of a so-called monstrum, which grants him a unique ability to zip around the city, and he is essentially boxed into Bolduc throughout the entire game, with the characters that later join him having the same perks. But even so, Monstrum Nox excels in its exploration and gameplay because of the setting itself. While I do prefer the offerings of, say, Ys VIII, it still makes the premise work. The city of Bolduc becomes a playground for the new Monstrum gifts given to the player. With everything so close together, the Monstrums are able to utilise their abilities to the limits, like gliding among the rooftops or running up the sides of buildings. As such, the group-based gameplay is arguably at its best here, very similar to Ys VIII mind you, but the Monstrum gifts bring a little extra to the table. It does stumble a bit in terms of its similar dungeon design, which is limited by the city of Bolduc itself, a lot of sewers for instance, and the music isn't as stellar as other games in my opinion, but it's got a lot of strong points too. Even with that praise though, I personally wouldn't recommend Ys IX as a starting point in the series. It's a fantastic game no doubt, but I purely say that because of its story. I actually think that the story in Monstrum Nox is among the best of the series, but that's because it understands its place in the lore of Adol's journeys. It's the last one in the timeline, and as such it can draw on many aspects of Adol's prior adventures, which it does on quite a few occasions. No doubt if you have that knowledge of earlier games, you'll enjoy it far more. Don't get me wrong, you can still start here as it is still a self-contained story for all intents, but I think if you want the best experience for what Monstrum Nox has to offer, you should start elsewhere. And that brings us to the end of the video, and I hope it's assisted you in clearing up any questions you may have had about the Ys series. I realise there's a lot to take in here, but I've tried to keep it as concise as possible to give you as much information as I can without outright spoiling what each game offers. If this gets a few more players into the series, then my job has been done. I adore this series, and anything I can do to give it the attention it deserves is time well spent. Until then, happy adventuring, and hopefully I'll see you around for when Ys 10 hits the shelves. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.